Dr. Alec is a sitar player, teacher, and researcher based in Edinburgh, Scotland. Alec has been studying sitar and vocal recitative since 2008. He completed his PhD in North Indian classical music in 2018. His research focuses on sitar and tabla performers' peak musical experiences, the musical and cultural means by which this ordered phase are achieved. Recently, he has developed an original empirical method to analyze the emergence of musical mobility in improvised sitar performance. Sir, we are fortunate to have you in this lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you all very much for being here, and thank you, Samida, for inviting me. So this is probably going to be a little bit different, I suspect, from what you've been hearing so far. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a new method of analysis that I've been working on over the past few years, which is meant to explore this facet of sitar music specifically, but also it can be applied to any type of improvised music in general, which is this idea of musical novelty. Yeah. So what do I mean by musical novelty? Um, Essentially, the concept is very simple. Novelty is the opposite of repetition. Yeah. So whenever we have a lot of repetition, the music becomes less novel, and whenever we have less repetition, the music becomes more novel. And so what this method of analysis does is trace this variability between novelty and repetition throughout a performance. Um, and at the moment, I'm looking at specifically within performances. Yes, so at the moment, I'm not using this as a way of comparing novelty across musicians or across genres. I just pick specific performances and look at how this principle operates within a performance. However, in the future, this could be then applied to look at broader questions, which I'll get to in a moment. But before I get started, I just want to say I'm gonna not go into too much detail. I'd rather just try to keep it as simple as I can, this presentation, and then if everyone has any questions, I can explain in a lot more detail some of the procedures involved for this analysis. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, novelty, I define it as the opposite of repetition, basically the simple definition. And novelty, what I found throughout my research and in my own experience as a sitar player and by talking to other musicians, is that it's a really central aesthetic principle in Indian classical music in general and sitar music specifically. So what I mean by this, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, which is that throughout the raga performance, which can go up to an hour or more, the musician is always trying to find new ways of presenting the same small collection of notes, whatever that raga is. So part of the challenge is how do I constantly come up with new musical ideas within this specific framework, which is established by the rag and the tal and form. Yeah. So as far as I can tell, and I think this is quite established, this idea of novelty is really important to Indian classical music. And that's why I argue that an analysis that explores this facet of Indian music and of improvisation in general can be very useful for various reasons. And another thing that I found while talking with musicians, part of my research during my PhD was trying to find out what peak musical experiences feel like. In other words, what is the best musical experience with a musician like? What is happening? Why does it feel so good? And one of the features that I found was that musicians always describe their peak experiences as involving high levels of musical novelty. So in other words, if I would ask them, can you try to go back and think about one of your best musical experiences, best performances, and what was special about it? And many times musicians will say something like, wow, I played something that I never played before. I don't know where the music was coming from. It was so original, you know? And the opposite is also true. So whenever musicians feel that they didn't have a good performance, quite often they say, well, I was just kind of repeating myself. I didn't know what to play, this kind of thing. Um, so what I'm arguing essentially is that by looking at musical novelty, we can use this as a tool in order to then explore other aspects of musical perception, creativity, style, and experience. Yeah. So now I'll get into my method. So essentially what my method does is it assigns every single sitar event. So, but what I mean by this is every single time the sitar player plays a note, essentially, a novelty value from 0 to 100. Yeah. So 0, it means a moment with absolute repetition, no novelty whatsoever. So if you were to analyze through this method what for instance, the Tampura player is doing, his novelty values will come very close to 0. Yeah, because there's very little novelty in what the Tampura player is doing. He's for the most part just playing the same notes over and over and over. Yeah. Then on the other extreme, 100 represents a moment of absolute novelty, where the musician is doing something unique, which only happens once in that performance. Yeah, it's always important to remember that this only applies to individual performances for the moment. So once we've got these values of 0 to 100 for every single sitar event, then we can correlate these values with other musical parameters, such as tal, the rhythmic cycle, or different formal sections, whether the sitar player is playing the gut as an accompaniment or whether he's doing his solos, yeah, and other aspects as well. And then we can even use this as a way of exploring how these values relate to the performer's personal experience of the music. Okay, so is essentially how the method works. So at the moment, this is in very early stages. Yes, I've only really managed to carry out one single analysis with this method at the moment, and I based it on extract of a performance by my guru, who's Devashish Sanyal from Varanasi, accompanied by a tabla player called Sodi Derge, which happened during his visit to Scotland a few years ago. The performance was based on rag mal counts, yeah, which, as you all know, is a pentatonic raga, which means we only have 5 notes. So this puts even more stress on this idea of novelty, because it's so limited in a way, the material that the musician has in terms of notes, just 5 notes spread over 3 octaves, which is the range of the sitar, and that's essentially everything he has to work with. And the extract itself is taken from the opening section of the Vilambit. So it lasts 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And it includes one gut section, which is 7 cycles long, during which the bashish is playing the gut while Sodi plays his tabla solo. And then a sitar solo section of 14 cycles long. Yeah. So this is what I will be analyzing and sharing with you today. So just to show you a little bit of this performance, just to get a sense of how it sounds, I'll just jump a bit. So this is the gut section. And if I jump further, somewhere here, this is I'll stop there, but just to give you a sense of what it is I'm actually analyzing. So this method involves 5 steps, which I'll explain in more detail in a second. But essentially, what we need to do is the following. First, we need to extract the sitar's pitch and rhythm data. Yeah. So in other words, essentially, it's transcribing the music. And you could see in the video below that I had the transcription both using Western staff notation and Indian Sargam system. Yeah. One important limitation about this method at this stage is that at the moment I'm not including ornamentation or dynamics or any other of these aspects. It's pure pitch and rhythm. So obviously in Indian music, ornamentation plays a huge role in generating novelty by mean and gamak and all these different effects. And also through dynamics, by playing soft and loud, you can generate different states of novelty. Yeah. At the moment, the method doesn't incorporate this, but in the future, it's something that I do hope to include in the analysis, yeah? So once we've extracted this data and we have our notes, basically, and our rhythms, then step number 2 is converting these symbols, these musical symbols, into a string data, yeah? So we need to convert it in, I'll show you in a second. Sorry, let me jump here. So for instance, what I did essentially is every note is assigned a letter, yeah? And so for instance, his solo starts with this phrase, goes da, ni, ni, sa, and it was transcribed to this series of symbols here, you see? So we have da, ni, ni, sa, yeah? And these dashes are used to mark rhythm. So one matra, I've divided it into 8 symbols, yeah? So that's basically how I've captured the rhythmic side of the music, yeah? I'm sorry if this is a bit confusing. I can definitely explain in more detail later, but I don't want to get like too much into this because it can be a bit confusing the more you go into it. But yeah, so basically what I need to do is convert the whole musical extract into a series of symbols like this, yeah? So once I've done that, then step number 3 is to insert this data into an algorithm that I wrote, which is meant to calculate the repetition within this series of data that we've inserted in the algorithm, yeah? So this is the algorithm here, yeah? Again, I won't go into details, but if anyone has any questions later, I'll be happy to explain further. But essentially what this does is if we insert our transcription here, then this algorithm, what it will do is it will calculate how many times does every single note or pattern of notes repeat within this whole extract, yeah? So, and you can program this to measure as large or small patterns of notes as you wish. Yes, so you can go from measuring just single notes to patterns of 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, and as far high as you want. For the purpose of this analysis, I've gone up to 16 notes, which is the equivalent of 2 matras in Vilambit, yeah, because I told you that each matra I've subdivided into 8 parts, yeah, so 16 notes is the equivalent of 2 matras. Sorry. And once I've passed my data through this algorithm, I get this. So let me explain a little bit what's going on here. So let's focus on this ni note here. This is the same phrase, by the way, which I told you earlier, the ni, ni, sa, the sa happens right after. So what this is telling us essentially is, in this extract, Komal ni, in its lower position, is happening 176 times. Then the pattern, silence ni, so this represents silence, a place where the sitar player is not playing a note, yeah? So this pattern of 2 notes, silence and ni, 106 times. Silence, silence, ni, 64 times. Silence, 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 ni, 63 times. Yeah, and all the way down up to 16. Yeah, so we've measured how many times do all these patterns repeat themselves. Then the following step is converting all these 16 values into a single average repetition, yeah, which describes how repetitive is that moment in time overall, considering all these 16 different layers, yeah, or sizes of patterns. And then the third step, no, sorry, the fifth step is converting these average repetition values here into a single novelty value, which lies from 0 to 100. Yeah. So unfortunately, I cannot see the value here, but you can see this one here. So for instance, this ni note here, according to my method of analysis, has a novelty value of 81.3. Whereas if we compare it with this da note here, this moment in time has a value of 92.8. So essentially what this is telling us is that this moment in time here, this da, in the context of this performance, is more novel than this ni here, yeah? And essentially what it means is that there is more repetition in this moment here than in this moment here. So this is just a little example, but I have this data for the entire 6 minutes and 40 seconds of the performance, yeah? So this is the process by which I convert the repetition values into novelty values. Again, I'm happy to explain in more detail if anyone wants to, but otherwise I'll just move on. And then the fifth step is correlating this with other aspects of the musical performance, which I'll explain in a second. But so essentially what I get is this type of results. Yeah. So let me explain what's going on here. Sorry, I'm going to hide this actually. Yes. So these are the novelty values for the entire extract. Yeah. And you can see in the vertical axis represents novelty. Yeah. So the higher the column, the higher the bar, sorry, the more novel that moment in time. And the horizontal axis represents time essentially. And these numbers are cycles, yeah, rhythmic cycles. So you can see this section here from 0 up to 7 is the opening gut section. And then from here, from 1 to 14 is the sitar solo section, yeah? And then the colors represent, firstly, so well, the yellow colors represent the most repetitive moments in this extract. Yes, so the least novel, the ones with the lowest novelty values. And the red bars represent the 10% highest novelty value. So the most novel moments, the moments that are less repetitive. Yeah. And then the blue bars are the middle, kind of the 80% in the middle. So one thing that you can see just by looking at this very easily is that here's the transition, right? From gut section to solo section. And you can see that almost all the most repetitive moments occur in the gut section, as one would expect, yeah? Because the sitar player is just repeating the gut over and over with variations, but essentially repeating the same melody. Whereas in the solo section, he's playing something new all the time. So here you can see that there's an increase in novelty and that most of the most novel moments occur in this solo section. So here you can see average novelty values per cycle for the same extract. So here in the first table is the gut section, and in the second table is the solo section. And you can notice several things. First, that overall, the average novelty values for the solo section are higher than the gut section, which is something that which we would expect, right? But what's interesting also is to see that even the gut section is very high in terms of its novelty. And this shows how even while the tabla player solo is playing his solo, the sitar player is still constantly changing the gut in order to keep it interesting and to respond to what the tabla player is doing. So this shows us how pervasive the idea of novelty is throughout the sitar performance, even where he's supposed to be playing in a more repetitive manner. Yeah. So what I would expect if we were to apply this same method of analysis to a completely different style of music, like a Western pop song, for instance, that the novelty values throughout would be a lot lower than this. So this is providing mathematical evidence in support of the idea that novelty is really important in Indian music. So here's another summary of some of the results. So as I just said, there's very high novelty values throughout. Yeah. Also that novelty is sustained and gradually increased throughout the solo, which is something surprising. So in other words, throughout these 14 cycles, the sitar player is managing not only to keep novelty constant, but to actually increase it so that new stuff happens more towards the end. So this is a way of keeping it interesting, essentially, yeah, for the audience. And then also, well, this contrast between gut and solo sections, which I mentioned earlier. Another very interesting result to come out of this is if we correlate these novelty values with the tal. So we look at where in the 16 beats of this, sorry, I forgot to mention that it's in tintal, by the way, so 16 beats. So where in these 16 beats is the sitar player playing either in a more novel manner or in a more repetitive manner? And it's very interesting to see, specifically in the gut section, that overall the novelty values are fairly low, but there's this consistent peak in novelty in beats 7 and 8. Yeah. And then a sharp decrease in novelty. And then around the mukra section from 12 to 1, there's a slight increase again. Yeah. So in other words, what this is telling us essentially is that the sitar player is playing essentially the same thing from beats 1 to 6, and then beats 7 and 8 is where he's most likely to play something different. and then come back to playing essentially the same thing, and then changing the mukra a little bit every time. So we can see how the sitar player is finding a balance between playing something that's repetitive enough to provide accompaniment for the tabla solo, but at the same time novel enough to keep interest, yeah, and keep it original. And then we can see how different the situation is in the solo section. So in the solo section, by contrast, it's almost consistently the same, the levels of novelty throughout. So we don't have any of these peaks that we saw in the gut section. Instead, the novelty is constantly high, except for this interesting dip that happens around beat 2 and to a lesser extent in beat 3, which what's happening here is not so much that he's repeating himself, but rather that whenever he reaches beat 1, he will normally play some kind of cadence, like at the high or something like that, and then stop playing for 1 or 2 beats. Yeah, so that's why we find that dip in novelty and into repetition in that beat. Yeah. And then the other thing we can do is zoom in into these moments of heightened novelty and try to discover, okay, how is the performer achieving this? Yeah, what kind of improvisational process or musical process is going on, which is allowing him to play something that's completely novel? And the answer will vary according to the performance, but in this particular performance, what I found is that the two main ways in which the sitar player maximizes novelty is, one is to rhythmic syncopation. Yes, so the most novel parts in this solo are when he plays triplets and quintuplets and sextuplets. Yeah, so when he's breaking the beat into odd divisions. Yeah, leikari essentially, that's what I'm trying to say. And then the other way in which he does it is by exploring the instrument's extreme high and low registers. Yeah. So often the most novel moments will be when he touches the very high sa. He only does this, I think, 2 times in this whole extract. And the same with the bottom sa. It only happens once or twice. So within the context of this extract, these are the most novel moments, the least repetitive moments. So to conclude, so what do we get out of this method of analysis that I'm developing here? One is that we get to actually visualize and analyze and yeah, explore this ebb and flow of novelty within the performance, which I've kind of described. Yeah, so see how there's these peaks of novelty and peaks of repetition, and find out what is causing them essentially and how they relate to other aspects. The other thing we can do is we are getting specific numerical values for measuring novelty. So through this, we can then carry out much broader comparative analysis, both for firstly across entire performances, not just extracts, but the whole hour-long raga. And then we can also, for instance, look at the entire repertoire of someone like Ravi Shankar, Vilayat Khan, whoever, and explore which of his performances are more or less novel and try to explore why. We can also do it comparing different musicians to just find out whether, I don't know, just to give an example, whether Ravi Shankar is more novel than Vilayat Khan or the other way around, and try to find out why and how. Yeah, and we can even do comparative analysis across genres. So as I mentioned earlier, I would expect that if we look at a pop song, the novelty values will be a lot lower than for an Indian classical music performance. So we can use this for stylistic analysis, yeah, and genre analysis. And the other thing that you can do is then use all of this insight as a way of gaining further insight regarding musical perception, creativity, and experience. So for instance, by exploring how this empirical data correlates with listeners' and performers' own experience. So for instance, having an experiment where we ask listeners to identify the moment within an extract where they feel there's the most novel, or you can ask them what's the most exciting part of this performance for you, or the most interesting, the most engaging, and then see how that correlates with novelty. And if we find a strong correlation, then we'll have more evidence to support this idea that novelty plays a crucial role in generating a positive, engaging, enjoyable sitar performance. And lastly, what I hope to do in the future with this. So as I said, this is very early stages. I've only in the process of publishing my first paper on this, so it's still very early. But things that I would like to do in the future include, firstly, what I think is really important is being able to incorporate other aspects of musical novelty, such as ornamentation, dynamics, and microtiming, and specifically ornamentation, being able to look at gamma and mean and all these things, which are so important to novelty in Indian music. So that's one thing. The other thing is incorporating the other musician. So obviously, if we have a sitar and tabla performance, the tabla player is also playing a very important role in the improvisational process and in the generating musical novelty. So looking at how novelty is being generated from the tabla player's perspective, and then how that relates to the sitar player, that would be another very interesting avenue of analysis. Then, as I said, carrying out broader comparative analysis, both within and across genres. And then lastly, exploring this idea, which I've been finding out through conversations and through my own experience, that peak musical experience in Indian classical music is very often closely related to higher levels of musical novelty. So, well, that's my presentation. I hope that was clear enough.
Again, how I mean, how you decide how what pieces you have taken. It cannot be very long, right? So maybe few minutes or
No, so this kind of ties the two parts together. So the biggest limitation, there's two big limitations that I have at the moment, and which is why I focused on a relatively short extract. One is transcription. So how do you extract sitar music in a way that's reliable? Yeah,
yes, that's
because
what the question. I mean, why? I'm so sorry to interrupt you because this question was in my mind, and the I think are you using any kind of software because how you are doing the
so
extraction?
so the transcription, I actually did it by ear. I did the whole transcription by ear. Uh, it helps that, well, I'm a sitar player, so I know what's happening, and he's my guru, so I know his style well, so that all helps. But I am also working with some colleagues on an automated way of transcribing sitar music.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
Partly because the sitar is a very special instrument, because it has so many strings, so that's a challenge in itself, because it's very hard for like a machine to know what's the difference between the baj string, the melody string, and the chikari strings and the taraf strings, because they're all happening in the same register. So that's
correct.
already a challenge. And then the other thing, well, all the ornamentations, the pullings, this makes it very hard to transcribe, because it's hard for the machine to know which note it is when you're going from ga to ma, this kind of thing. So so that's one limitation, is automated transcription. And then the other limitation is converting this into symbols, because that's why I focus just on pitch, because pitch, you can say, okay, there's sa and there's ga and there's ma, and you can assign an S and a G and an M to each note, and that's easy. But how do you symbolize a pulling pattern that goes sa ga ma, for instance? Then it becomes much harder. So that's why I decided to focus just on pitch and rhythm, which I agree it's a limitation, but at the same time, I would argue that it is the foundation of what's happening in a way.
So
As important as ornamentation is,
think
pitch
here.
and rhythm are like the foundation upon which you can then put ornaments and dynamics and all these other things.
Yeah, that's what even I was just thinking about that only, and how to do all these things. Yes. Anyways, so it's an enriching presentation, I would say, and our students have learned a lot. I mean, everyone is like, "Wow, what's going on?"
Well,
So
hopefully
thank
this
you.
paper should be published quite soon, and I can forward it to you and you can share it with your students, because
Sure,
I also explain in a lot more detail the whole methodological process, which I didn't want to really go into right now because it's a bit complicated.
yeah. Yeah. So, thank you so much. I mean, it was like
My pleasure. Thank you for the
yes,
invitation, Samida.
it was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining me. Thank you.